What am I unleashing when I tell someone that they're a sinner? I'm unleashing the unlimited potential for fear into them, into being a sinner, identifying as that. So that's an irrational potential that's being ignited. I'm not potentiating, I'm not coaxing out of you a rational potential when I say that you're a sinner. This is where Christianity is psychologically defunct. By saying that a person is a sinner, you're putting them into an irrational space because there's no end to the consequences of being a sinner. There's no end because the lake of fire has no boundary. Okay. This is because the imagination doesn't have boundaries. It has unlimited potential. So when you prey on someone by convincing them that they're a sinner, you're now unlocking unlimited fear in them and need to be saved in them. That becomes an anxiety. That becomes, again, we're all in the secondary here. That becomes an anxiety because now the person has this idea of themselves that they're separated. They have this idea of themselves that the only way to take apart the world is through sin and atonement. That's it. That's the only way that you can unravel the human problem, quote unquote. And believing that there is a problem is the problem. Because again, the person is in a trauma bond. They're locked to the idea that they're a sinner. Okay, now let's see how this develops. We have unlimited potential within us. I'm going to reread this again. We have unlimited potential within us, and it can go in a positive or rational sense, and it can go in a negative or irrational sense. As in the curious case of a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, which involved a trauma bonding event. What I do here to help the Christians see that they're in a trauma bond is I open up this bank robbery event, which carries a trauma bonding agent within it, a coping mechanism within it. And I juxtapose the prisoners in this, the captives in this story, with the Christian. I'm giving you a pregame here to help you follow this in a deeper sense as I go. But what I'm trying to do here is for the Christian to be able to mentally picture in their mind and see in their mind these hostages inside this safe. And then also see themselves as a hostage inside their own mind with the idea that they're a sinner. You've had this idea put into your mind and you've bought this idea. It's a straw man that you're a sinner. And so I'm trying to take that concept, that psychological concept, and put that into an actual reality so that the Christian can see these two things more clearly, can see themselves as a prisoner in their own mind, just like the captives that are in prison inside the bank vault. And these two positions can be juxtaposed very easily inside a person's psychology, inside their head. And so because that's the case, I've used this story to elucidate the prison that the person is put into when they're put into the idea that they're a sinner and the world is fallen. That's the background to this. That's the pregame to this. All right, here we go. And basically, Stockholm Syndrome is a coping mechanism the brain subconsciously develops in response to situations of extended trauma or capture bonding. What's the key word in that sentence? Subconsciously. They develop a coping mechanism in the brain subconsciously. All right? So it's what is that? That's not a choice. Here we are. In the space where love and hate are, no choice. The same space, the subconscious, now is developing a coping mechanism without the person even realizing they're developing the mechanism. The subconscious has begun to develop a syndrome called the Stockholm Syndrome. The syndrome is not limited or related to crime. It is a human coping mechanism that comes out of an untenable situation from which an individual cannot escape. Can the sinner escape being a sinner? No. Can a sinner escape hell? No, not without grace they can't. Can a sinner escape the fact that they're separated from God? Without grace, I'm saying their original condition of being a sinner. Can they escape the condition that they are separated from God? Not without grace, they can't. You see what's happening here? They're caught. The Christian is caught in the vault just like those captives were caught in the vault. It's the same picture. When in a Stockholm Syndrome trauma bond, the abused forms positive feelings towards their assailant as a mechanism to cope with the horror of the situation. What is happening in Christianity? The abused, the person who is told that they're a sinner, forms positive feelings towards who? The aggressor. Who told them that they're a sinner? God did. God is the aggressor in this case. And because the person must accept this, they are caught in a trap, a psychological trap of being a sinner, and God cannot accept them as they are, as the sinner. Grace must be installed. Here is the key thing. The reason why the person can have a relationship with God is because grace is in place. That's the coping mechanism. The coping mechanism that the Stockholm Syndrome uses inside the sinner is grace. That's the coping mechanism, because that's the only way you can cope with being a sinner is through grace. You see how this works? So the assailant, the aggressor who is causing there to be the idea of being a sinner, is the culprit in this case, because that is what is putting the individual into the mechanism, into the situation of being a sinner. God puts them there because that's the Word of God. The Word of God is every person is born a sinner. Every person is separated from God. That's the condition. And my argument is, no, those are secondary aspects. That's not the prime condition. The prime condition is that you're a nature being. You have all potentials in you already. That's the prime condition. You have all the hate and love and jealousy and all of the emotions already in you. You have all of these things in you. You're born with them already in you. That's your primary reference. This is what must be accorded. Not the idea that you're a sinner. Not the idea that you're separated from God. Those are secondary. The primary is according the fact that I have all potentials in me already. I am the master of those things. Meaning my choices determine where those potentials go. And so my reference then is the fact that I have unlimited potential, not that I'm a sinner born to sin. That's a secondary. That is an anomaly. That is to put someone into a syndrome, is to give them that idea. Okay. The abused forms positive feelings towards their assailant as a mechanism to cope with the horror of the situation. So how does the Christian form positive feelings towards the assailant? Through grace. Through grace. Because that's how the sinner will then come into quote-unquote accord with God, is through grace. You see how that works here? So the mechanism to cope with the horror of the situation is Jesus. And in this way, right then and there, Jesus becomes a codependent with the sinner. Because the sinner is dependent upon Jesus, the coping mechanism to deal with the fact that they're a sinner, to give them access to God. You see how this is a mechanism. This is a psychological mechanism that is put into people like you would put a hamster on a hamster wheel. And a person will spend their life running on this mechanism: sin and atonement, grace, being saved from oneself, being saved from a fallen world. And they will run on that wheel and run on that wheel until death, because that's the only reality, the only world that they're willing to accept, because that world is under control, under a will. That's why this is so tantalizing to the Christian, because it stabilizes this idea of spirit. It takes them out of the idea of being an enigma, which is hard to come into accord with. And so by putting spirituality into these specific concepts and notions, you stabilize the situation, and that creates stagnancy. Stagnancy is disease. Stagnancy leads to disease. And so if you stagnate the person's spirituality with these ideas, you see, no more development happens, because the Christian can only imagine a world that requires a Messiah. So you've locked them in. And so that's a bond. It's like a giant prison that the Christian is within. And the world is only this big, and that's it. And by keeping it small like that, it remains in control in their mind, and therefore you become a control freak. You become a control freak when it comes to spirituality, because a Christian can't imagine any other spirituality but one that anoints them as a sinner, but one that requires grace, but one that requires a world to be saved. They are in that very small spiritual sphere, And so it's under control because it can be cognized and known. And see, my argument here is that life can't be cognized and known. Life can't be put into control because nature has all potentials, and that's what you are. You see, and so there's cognitive dissonance that happens when you believe a person is a sinner, but also believe that they're a whole being. There's enormous cognitive dissonance that happens there, and that's why the Christian ends up thinking nutty thoughts and believing nutty things. With all due respect, I don't say that disrespectfully, but these are nutty ideas to think that the world is separated into in-groups and out-groups, because that's conflict. These are nutty ideas to think that the universe is a good versus evil situation, because that's conflict. And when you base your life on the ideas of conflict, basing your life on the idea that you're a sinner, you lead to more conflict. Nothing gets resolved. You're stagnant. You're always on the hamster wheel in the same space, you see. And so what must be accorded is the idea that you're a whole being with all potentials. All potentials. Just as much potential to harm as to help. Equally. Okay. Stockholm Syndrome.